Good morning, everyone. It's been a long time. A man approaches one of the houses and knocks on the door. And when the owner of the house answers, the homeless man asks him for a meal. The owner replies that he would be happy to feed the man in exchange for some honest work. He tells the homeless man to go into the garage, get a can of paint from the shelf, and put a fresh coat of paint on his porch. An hour later, the wealthy man hears a knock at his door again. When he opens the door, he is greeted again by the homeless man who says, "Hey, I'm all finished up with that paint job, but you should know that it's a BMW in there, not a Porsche." That's it.
Okay.
um, Charles Dickens wrote The Tale of Two Cities in 1859. It begins, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness." Excuse me. It was the epic of belief, it was the epic of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope and it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the Depression and present day, it is hard to read. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The Depression lingered on. Food was in short supply. There were no jobs. Bread lines were blocks long. Soup kitchens were feeding hundreds of people. Money was in short supply. Homes were lost. Bank accounts and savings were wiped out, and lives were lost. Am I alluding to present day? Yes and no. It was a depression I was speaking of, 1929 to 1939. This was one of the eras that my family lived through. But it was during that time that I was taught empathy. And that's what it was all about. Have you ever been hungry? Have you ever not had enough to eat? Your stomach rumbling without food? Or in pain from lack of nourishment? There were and are so many who are and were in the depths of despair. The depression tainted my father for fear of having no food or necessities. So he never bought one of anything. He would send me to market to buy groceries, and on the list would be soup. Not just one can of soup, but a case of soup. He would buy coffee and flour and sugar by the case. Never would a family member or a family larger member ever go hungry. It might not have been right, but to him it was necessary, and it would carry over all the way through World War II. He was simply scared. But at the same time, he would give the shirt off his back to those who needed help. He was the kindest and most gentle man I have ever known. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I remember my mother also as a strong, kind, and gentle woman, feeding the homeless men and women and giving them jobs around the property. This was not quid pro quo. It was her way of sharing and saving the dignity of other human beings. I remember my mother as my mother Teresa, performing acts of kindness in a time of distress. What would you do today? What would we hear today? Don't talk to strangers and be cautious of your surroundings. But the one that hits the hardest for me is not in my backyard. Please don't answer me by saying this is a different time. Human beings are human beings. A definition might be in order. So let's start with an era. An era is not a defined number of years. Rather, it is a period of time marked by certain characteristics, such as historical events. We all have lived long enough to have lived through a myriad of eras, some of them good, some of them not so good. Let me share a story. A friend of mine shared a memory that has haunted him for decades. It was an early Saturday morning in November, the day of the high school cross-country championship for the state of Pennsylvania. He was just 17 years old, and he was walking from his home to the high school where he would climb on a bus that would take him and his fellow runners to State College. They were one of the few favorite teams to win the championship, and he was excited, he was nervous, and he was freezing. It was a bitterly cold morning, snowing hard, with an inch or so already on the ground. And as he reached the wooden footbridge over the canal that split the city in two, he saw a little boy, maybe 5, maybe 6 years old. The boy was just standing there next to the bridge, shivering. He had no gloves on, and his nose was running. My friend didn't know what to do. He had no money, and even if he did, he doesn't know what he would have done with it. So he pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the little boy's nose and gave the boy his handkerchief and then walked on. He said that he's never talked about that moment until now, but he thought about it often. He wonders whatever became of that little boy. He has said to himself many times, I should have done more, but what? He does not presume that God placed the little boy there for an encounter, but he does believe that in and through that little boy, God touched his heart to teach him that religion is not primarily a set of beliefs, that Christianity, if it makes any sense at all, is not about how confidently we affirm lines of a creed, but what we do about a little boy shivering in the cold at the foot of a bridge. His was the type of experience that ought to get under our skin, not in order to beat up on ourselves, but to ratchet up our level of guilt for not responding better, but to serve as a life lesson so that on future occasions, when we encounter human need, we will act differently. One only hopes. The pain and suffering we encounter can make us callous and indifferent. We can train ourselves to avert our gaze from people who are hurting and to focus only on the pleasant thoughts. Or we can be empathetic to the sufferings of others and reach out to them as best we can. This morning's passage reminds us that empathy is one of the essential characteristics of a Christian-like life. Its roots are formed in the familiar words of Jesus, known as the Golden Rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Before we go further, let's listen to another definition of empathy. Empathy is a noun. It is an action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another, past or present. Empathy, then, is when you feel what someone else feels. It is seeing the world from the perspective of another. It is grasping as fully as possible what someone else experiences. In the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, the author writes, "Remember those who are in prison, as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured, as though you yourself are being tortured." So I am appealing to our empathetic imagination. We are not just to feel sorry for those in need, we are to feel with those in need as if the burden has become our own. Just as an amputee has been known to feel the phantom pain in an arm or a leg that no longer exists, so too the followers of Jesus to feel the pain of others as if it existed in our own body. In many circumstances, it is natural to empathize with people who suffer. Certainly in the past months, we have witnessed tremendous destruction meted out by weather, disease, and frightening attacks by Americans on Americans. It would be abnormal for us to be indifferent to their sufferings and to be unable to picture ourselves experiencing similar pain. However, in some circumstances, it is difficult to empathize with the trials of another. If we have the knack for learning, it may be hard to identify with someone who has learning disabilities. If we have never been depressed, it may be impossible for us to imagine how dark life can appear for someone who feels utter hopelessness. Sometimes it's not easy to fully grasp the sufferings of others. Excuse me. Then there are times when we purposely block out pain of others. Perhaps life is going well for us and we are afraid that the suffering of others will drag us down. Or maybe we believe that the one who is suffering brought it on herself and deserved what she is getting. Or perhaps we view the one who suffers as an adversary. We need to keep in mind what Jesus said immediately after saying, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." He said, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good for those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. But love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High. For God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your father, mother is merciful. Or as some scholars translate this verse, be compassionate, as God is compassionate. Jesus urges us to have empathy for those so that we will treat them as we would want them treated. He's not saying to strike a bargain. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. He's simply saying, take the risk of being compassionate to others. And that's it. We are not all in the same boat. We are in the same storm. Some have yachts, some have canoes, and some are drowning. Just be kind and help where you can. But remember, if you do open up these new possibilities, you will do wonders for your own soul. Amen.